Yes, this is World Insight, and I'm Tian Wei. We begin our program today with rising trade tensions over the U.S. tariffs. In the past few months, the Trump administration has levied new duties, which did not sit well with its trade partners. The wrangling over Mr. Trump's trade policy has sent ripples both inside and outside the U.S. less than 5 months until the U.S. midterm elections. Affected nations have filed WTO cases against Washington, and on Monday, the U.S. president even warned his trading partners, well, we'll be doing something about WTO. Well, let's take a look. What are the latest developments?
Mr. Trump is frustrated with the WTO. He told reporters that the trade organization needs to change its ways during a White House meeting with Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte. He denied plans to withdraw from the WTO, but he minced no words in expressing his disappointment.
WTO's treated the United States very badly, and I hope they change their ways. They have been treating us very badly for many, many years, and that's why we were at a big disadvantage with the WTO. And we're not planning anything now, but if they don't treat us properly, we will be doing something. Thank you.
Earlier, the U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer has defended American tariffs on steel and aluminum, saying they were imposed under a national security threat, which is allowed under the WTO. That did little to stop many U.S. trade partners from filing WTO complaints against the metal tariffs and accused the U.S. of violating international trade rules, with Russia recently filing a complaint after Canada and the EU. The U.S. has already been hit with retaliatory tariffs from Canada, the EU, Mexico, and India, which largely target metal products and farm goods. This week, the U.S. and China are expected to slap more tariffs against each other.
And that's one of my biggest fears. You put these tariffs, but now you're going to exclude everybody, so they're kind of pointless.
Besides international outrage, the Trump administration's protectionist policies also drew domestic criticism. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce calculated that proposed and current tariffs threaten as many as 2.6 million American jobs. The Chamber has launched a campaign opposing Mr. Trump's trade policy, though it has donated more than $100,000 to Republican congressional candidates in the past 6 months alone. And some major agricultural states could suffer no thanks to trade disputes. Mr. Trump once said tariffs would put U.S. companies and workers on stronger footing, but his decision could backfire. His tariff policy is a bone of contention among Republicans and Democrats in the upcoming midterm elections.
For more on Trump's trade policy, we are joined in Beijing studio by Einar Tangen, a political affairs commentator. Welcome, sir. Also joining us in Washington, D.C., U.S., Bruce Fein, an American lawyer who's former Associate Deputy Attorney General under President Reagan. Welcome, sir. And in San Jose, U.S. as well, Huang Zhengyu, the chairman of Yu Capital, who's a former White House fellow during the Obama years. Welcome as well. So we got Republican, Democrat in the discussion, and probably somebody in between. So let me start by asking you, Mr. Fein, how much do you think the debate now involving trade will eventually split your country? Obviously, there are states that are more likely to be influenced by the anti-tariff tariffs levied by the U.S. trading partners, and also there are states that's less likely to be influenced. What do you think?
Well, I think the heart of the business community is unified against what President Trump is doing. I don't think it's lost any of Trump's base. I do not believe that trade was a major campaign issue that solidified support for his election to the presidency. At least at present, moreover, the volume of international trade affected by the tariffs is relatively small compared to the global trading community. If it continues to escalate, there's no doubt there'll be a pinch on the economy. I think free trade and the absence of tariffs is what politicians call as a win-win. It can benefit both countries that are involved in the trade. But one thing that people often forget is that political math is not economic math. Simply because something makes sense to economists at MIT or Harvard or Stanford doesn't mean it makes sense to a politician.
Okay.
Because the most important element here is looking at who benefits and who loses.
Well,
The
there are a lot of
beneficiaries
calculations
the
already going on.
restrictions
Mr. Feng,
free
if I could
trade
have you
are
later to
relatively
talk on
few.
our program, we give more airtime to the others as well. Let me go to you, Mr.
Okay,
Huang,
thanks.
in San Jose. I mean, when you look at that, the trading partners of the United States, the EU, Russia, Mexico, and Canada all reacted. And very likely, if July the 6th, U.S. go with its rhetoric to so-called punish China with tariffs unilaterally. China is also likely to react just like the other trading partners. So the math is getting ever bigger. Eventually, do you think it's going to make a difference? Political math, economic math?
Yeah. Well, first of all, happy 4th of July to everybody.
Thank you.
You know, to answer your question, I think currently the steel and aluminum tariffs are about $40 billion. The upcoming potential tariff on China is about $35 billion. So that's $75 billion out of an $18 trillion economy. So that's slightly less than 0.5%. And the economy of the United States was growing at about a 2.2% rate last quarter. So, and we're not going to lose all of that 0.5%. So in the short term, I think the impact will not be as large as people would think. However, with Trump potentially threatening another $200 billion of tariffs on China, the EU talking about a $300 billion retaliatory tariff on the United States, this could escalate very quickly. And I think that's the danger inherent in this.
Political math, economic math, or trade math. Let's take a look at what is the areas that's likely to be impacted. The battle over tariffs could test voter support, some say, for Mr. Trump, for the midterm election as well. Canada, Mexico, EU have tariffs targeting U.S. manufacturing and agricultural states, hitting products such as steel and aluminum, whiskey, maple syrup, cigars, and jeans. Several U.S. states could feel the heat of the retaliatory duties. For example, Michigan rely heavily on the steel and motor industry. Wisconsin, known for milk and cheese, and Illinois for soybean production. Of course, at this point, we still do not know what is the U.S. list and what's likely to be China's list in response to the U.S. tariffs on China. So, Mr. Tangen, what about that list? Is that going to be a list that's going to ring a bell in the political math?
I would agree that it would. And I would disagree that Trump did not run on trade. He did very much. He said he was going to get rid of NAFTA. He was going to take America first, and it was make America great again. So I would differ with my colleague on that. In terms of what this is going to do to the U.S., it is going to be a political math. Right now, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the most powerful chamber in the United States.
Representing the business community.
Representing tens of thousands. Now, you have to understand that it's not just the chamber as a national body. This chamber is connected to every chamber in every town, every city across America. And they are now mobilizing their people. Every 2 hours over the last 24, they have been putting out comments, talk points, interviews, and they're making a full court press. They are calling this a disaster. Now, remember, we're coming up to election season. Who pays for the election? Business, especially if it's a Republican side. And they're going to be calling their senators and congressmen and say, we don't care whether you like Donald Trump or not. If you don't get this thing settled, you can get my check when it comes to this. And this is not more. It's about jobs. 2.6 million jobs are at stake here because this round is very small. The next rounds could be big.
It's very interesting, Mr. Feng, that both sides are citing jobs as the reason why they're standing where they are and why they are for or against what exactly the rhetoric that's going on in Washington. And Mr. Feng, eventually, how will the different rhetorics being tested politically?
Well, the first thing I would underscore is that despite the influence of the chamber and the authority of Congress, which is controlled by Republicans who are largely free trade, to override what President Trump has done by statute. Even if he vetoed it, they could at least vote to override his trade restrictions. None of them have done so. They have stated on the floor of Congress they're disappointed, 1, 2, 3, 4, but all of them shied and backed away because the president still has enormous clout, I think in their view more clout than the Chamber of Commerce, and affecting their electoral chances in the fall. Now, I think you put a very good point on. Both sides are able to claim what they're doing is job preservation. It's simply whose job is being preserved as opposed to someone else's job. The beneficiaries of Trump are known because they're already occupying a job already. The jobs that aren't created because you don't have new business enterprises or expansions because the increased cost of imports are not known. The voters can't be identified. And I think that's what gives political traction to what Trump is doing.
Very interesting point over there, but you see, even within the Republicans, of course, people are saying these days it's also about the Trump Republicans because Donald Trump in the earlier 7 primaries did very well when he supported a candidate. That candidate very likely to get the title from that specific constituency. But having said that, though, Mr. Huang, you've been a White House fellow, but of course during the Democrats' years when Obama was in power. How much do you think the other voices of the Congress will be able to balance? If you think about the majority leader, for example, in the Senate, or some of those in the House of Representatives, very powerful voices, they're actually the states that's going to be influenced by the counter tariffs imposed on the United States by the others.
It's a great question. So whether you agree with Donald Trump or not, he has a very coherent economic message, America first. And what I see today is throughout his base, his approval rating is about 80 to 90%. And he has quite a few issues besides trade that his base highly supports, whether it be now 2 nominations to the Supreme Court, the tax reform bill, immigration bans, etc. And I don't think today there's a countervailing economic message coming out of either the established Republicans or the Democrats. And without such a unified counter-economic message, I think we will continue to see his economic message predominate. And his economic message is really predicated when it comes to trade, that tariffs is not necessarily a bad thing. I think Donald Trump truly believes that the imposition of tariffs, if it makes other countries lower their protectionist measures, that's good. If it continues, that's also good because he believes that that will bring jobs to the United States because companies will want to set up companies in the United States because of higher tariffs. Whether that's true or not, only time will tell.
All right. Mr. Tangen, you see this is not the only issue that Mr. Trump, his administration, is having certain kinds of discussion, to say the least, with the rest of the country. There are trade issues. There are also the affirmative action issues, which is big inside the United States. There's migration issues about family separation, about the wall with Mexico, things like that. And you've also got a lot of other issues all at the same time. So eventually, the trade issue, is it going to gain points for Trump, if you think about the overall story leading up to the midterm election, or is it going to be the one that's actually going to lose points for Trump among all of these?
Well, you mentioned calculations earlier, and that's exactly what we have here. I mean, Donald Trump has indicated that he's going to withhold a decision on NAFTA till after the elections. Yes. His group is trying to figure out exactly what the timing is going to be in terms of the harm that's going to be created. They know there's going to be something to pay at the end of this. The question is when. Now, I disagree that in politics in the U.S., it does not come top down. It comes from the bottom up. Elections are run on money, and these businessmen are going to be talking big because they are the ones who continually to finance these elections. So I completely disagree.
Mr. Tangen, after staying here in China for some time, you seem to disagree with some of your colleagues back in the United States. And now, Mr. Fein, I mean, you are coming from the side of law, in a way, working for earlier during the Reagan administration. Now the 9, so-called, the Supreme Court judges, one of them retired, and it's likely, many call him the deciding vote. That deciding vote now gone, and now candidates for the possible one going to take that place is being tested right now. So how will all of these issues eventually influence some of the discussions even related to the fundamental issue right now, which is to find the 9th person of the Supreme Court? These are all interlinked, as you may know very well, Mr. Feng. Go ahead, sir.
Yes, and I participated when I was at the department in filling vacancies too, including Justice Scalia in 1986. I think that the replacement is undoubtedly going to be more conservative, if you will, more aligned with Mr. Trump's social policies as translated into constitutional doctrine than was Anthony Kennedy. He was often called, you know, the fifth vote, the Kennedy court, because his vote was oftentimes crucial between a solid flank of 4 liberals and 4 conservatives. And the Republicans do control the Senate. They will be the ones deciding to confirm a nominee of Mr. Trump. The persons he's interviewed so far are all decidedly to the right of Mr. Kennedy. So I do think that this particular confirmation would solidify what we call as a legal field as executive power. It will have a court that is likely, as it did even with Kennedy's vote, endorsing Mr. Trump's ban on immigration for selected countries and giving a broad interpretation of unilateral executive power. And that will be important as some of these legal issues relating to Mr. Trump's ability to create tariffs or put in quotas based upon a national security claim that seems to be clearly an economic rather than a national security claim, and those issues are already in court.
Right.
So the vacancy clearly, I think, will strengthen President Trump going forward.
I see. Mr. Huang, now it's really about timing. A lot of things being tested, and we all know this is strategy and technique of President Trump, which is to mix a lot of things together, make sure that there are different voices, and he would come in and try to get the best benefits, the biggest benefit out of the chaos. Knowing his technique, Mr. Huang, what is likely to be the next step? I mean, if you see these trade disputes going on, these tariffs and anti-tariff tariffs, what is likely to be the next step for countries in discussion with the United States? Or this is likely to be just go on being escalated? Mr. Huang.
Yeah, this is a great question, right? This is probably the trillion-dollar question. Now, if we look at how American tariffs are imposed, typically there's a period about 2 to 3 months to take in public comments and public input. So, for example, between U.S. and China, after the initial $34–35 billion, there's going to be a respite about 2 to 3 months for the additional $15 billion. And so that time might call for more negotiations. And the hope, I think, for a lot of people is that negotiations can reassume during that period of time. Now, I do want to point out one larger strategic issue, which is for 70 years, the United States, since World War II, has created international systems such as GATT, which is the predecessor to WTO, IMF, World Bank, and bound its allies through access to its vast market. And for Mr. Trump to come in, for President Trump to come in with his American First policy and basically saying, you know what, I'm going to tear all that apart, it's going to create a lot of uncertainty going forward. Because even when there's discussions about, you know, mutual lowering of tariffs, people are still going to wonder, is America trustworthy for the long term? And the sustainability of these international institutions, I think that's a longer-term discussion that almost all policymakers in America should be concerned about.
But, Mr. Feng, will that be a concern for voters, let's just say, leading up to the midterm election? If you think about the president, probably that's the only date he cares that much these days. So if the negative feelings or the negative impact is not being felt immediately, the politician would get their way, right?
I think you made a very splendid point. The voters typically look at the short run, not the long run. You know, as John Maynard Keynes said, in the long run, we're all dead. And I do believe that what the president is doing in trade, and it could lead to a pullout from the World Trade Organization, and it could be similar to what we may witness at his NATO summit next week, and suggesting maybe the commitment to NATO has lived its course and pull out as well as part of his overall program. And I agree exactly that creating uncertainty, in my judgment, for the long term is not going to handicap Mr. Trump in the short term, because politics, you know, a week is a year. And that's simply how the political animal acts, the short run rather than the long run, even if in the long run we go off of a cliff.
But, Mr. Fain, I mean, the Republican Party have to think about it if the President Trump is not necessarily right now thinking about it. The party has to think about its long-term interest. The party has to think about the next election after the midterm. The party has to think about whether the future generation really want to follow this political party anymore, or the Democrats are likely to get all of the sympathy and also the support in the future if things are going in the long term negative for the United States. So, Mr. Fain, once again, you didn't read much out of the Republican Party. Does it mean the weakness of the party, or does it mean that politicians, whether it is whatever branch of the American government, is only looking at short term, and therefore there's a very interesting, shall I say, problem with that system?
Yeah, well, I agree with your observation. I deal with Congress, you know, virtually every day. And I can tell you the influence of the president over how members vote and what they do politically compared to the Republican National Committee is like 1,000,000 to 1. The parties and the party structure has fallen enormously as opposed to the prominence of the president in the White House when it comes to influencing Congress. And we don't no longer have a Republican Party that looks in the long run. If, in fact, there was, Mr. Trump would never have received the nomination because all of the basic party institutions and instruments were opposed to him.
Well, Mr. Huang, it seems that according to Mr. Fain, the Republican Party just doesn't care.
Well, if you look at American political history since World War II, there's actually been a remarkably consistent set of foreign policy, especially around trade. I think Trump is upending all of that. And I think today, both the established Republicans and the Democrats are grappling with a set of alternatives that both resonate with voters in the short term but make sense for America for the long term. And I think that grappling is happening behind the scenes, but I know it's happening. But there isn't today a very compelling narrative to what Trump is saying.
Mr. Huang, you have to give us some details when you're saying people are grappling behind the scenes. Is there anything that you can share with us about any signs of possible different approaches?
Well, for example, within the Democratic Party, right, there is an economic message emerging. It's around what Bernie Sanders articulated in 2016, universal health care, free college tuition, minimum wage, etc. But that's not currently the mainstream Democratic economic message. So within that party, we see, you know, a lot of discussions on what is the Democrats going to talk about if it continues to claim to be the party of the working people. Because today, many of those working people are voting for Trump. And within the Republican Party, something I think similar is happening too. I mean, is there a counter-narrative? Now, it's very hard when your sitting president is espousing one thing. But I think a lot of policymakers are talking about, okay, what will it be potentially for the long term, maybe even after Trump?
Mr. Kangan, here's the thing. It would be extremely sad and pathetic if one political election, let's just say the coming midterm election 3 months from now, 4 months from now rather, it's going to influence the long-term approach of a country's strategy about its relations with the rest of the world and about how the rest of the world would see this country, isn't it?
Yes, it will, and it's about trust. Predictability. While politics might be short-term, the fact is in both business and diplomacy, it's a long-term game. So trust is going to be one of the big issues here, and Donald Trump, I don't think, has it.
Well, he doesn't have it. Whether that's true or not, we're going to see how things would evolve. But for now, we hope the trade war would not continue. We hope people come to reasonable thoughts. We hope people will be more responsible for the globalization that is certainly taking place right here and elsewhere in the world. Thank you so much, the three of you, for being with us. Einar Tangen, Bruce Fain, Huang Zhengyu. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us.